Finally, time to watch some Pride and Prejudice. This has been a long time coming. This is crazy.
That's quiet. Mom?
This. What we're standing on. It's an unmarked zombie graveyard.
Yes, of course.
The heck am I? Oh. Hey everyone, my name is Noah Real, and I'm here sitting on my couch, and I want to talk today about the themes of pride and confidence. Like 6 or so months ago, I promised that Pride and Prejudice was going to be the next thing I was going to tackle on this channel. And trust me, it's been a nightmare ever since. I have had no idea what to talk about with this movie. Initially, I was thinking of doing a purely comedic video where I just make fun of all of the characters. But considering the cult following that this movie has, I don't think that would have been the greatest idea. And I'm not going to lie, initially when I watched the movie, I thought it was stupid. I mean, it was an entertaining movie, it was funny, but every character is as annoying as heck. I mean, like, Mr. Darcy to me initially was a character that just reminds me of a can of LaCroix. You know how when you take a can of LaCroix and you think that it's going to be good and you drink it and you realize how tasteless it is? But it's like desperately trying to taste like something. That's how Mr. Darcy's character is. It's like he's trying so hard to have a personality, but he just doesn't. And you drink it. You drink LaCroix because everyone else does and everyone else says it's good. But every time you're disappointed. I mean, that's how I thought of Mr. Darcy initially. And then I dug a little deeper. I dug so deep that I started reading the book and even bought the official Jane Austen coloring book. That's right, folks. That's how dedicated I am to my craft. So, I mean, you know that I'm a Pride and Prejudice expert. I'm joking. I'm not, and I never want to be. But anyway, as I dug deeper and started reading the book, I realized the deep themes of Pride and Prejudice. On the surface, it's just a romantic story that's kind of sweet, kind of nice, and mostly annoying. But when you look deeper, you realize the true theme of Pride and Prejudice. The theme of Pride and Prejudice is, are you ready for this? Pride. That's right. It's right in the title. Jane Austen wasn't trying to fool anybody. Now wait, before you guys click off the video, because at this point I'm just stating the obvious, I want you to listen a little bit more because the novel Pride and Prejudice deals with the differences between positive and negative pride. It shows us that pride in who you are is not just a negative thing, but if you look at it the right way, it can also be a very positive thing. In order to understand the difference between this vain pride and confidence that's good for you and is healthy, we have to look at the different characters of Pride and Prejudice because the different characters completely personify these different types of pride. I think in the story, Elizabeth Bennet, Mr. Bennet, and Mr. Darcy really personify this kind of self-confidence that's not proud, that's not vain, but is healthy and good. On the other hand, characters like Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Collins, and Miss Bingley represent a very negative and vain sort of pride that just ends up being really annoying and obnoxious. Okay, before I go into these characters, let me talk a little bit more about this idea of the two different types of pride. Pride as in vanity and pride as in confidence. What those two different things mean and how they're represented in the book. Towards the beginning of the film and the book, Elizabeth Bennet goes over to Mr. Darcy's estate and she's kind of like, I guess, helping her sister out because her sister's really sick. She caught a cold in the rain because her mother made her ride a horse instead of sitting in a carriage, which is actually just absolutely terrible, but we'll get to the mother in a second. Anyway, Elizabeth is taking care of Jane at Mr. Darcy's estate, and because of that, she runs into him and his family quite a lot. And one of the first big interactions we get between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, Mr. Darcy says these words, quote, "Nothing is more deceitful than the appearance of humility. It is often only carelessness of opinion and sometimes an indirect boast." In the next chapter, Elizabeth sarcastically refers to his vanity and his pride. And he responds by saying this, quote, "Yes, vanity is a weakness, but pride, where there is a real superiority of mind, pride will always be under good regulation." So you see that. Right there, Mr. Darcy's making a distinction between pride and vanity. So Pride and Prejudice at its core is about vain pride versus confidence. But what does that mean? What do these two different types of pride look like? How do they look in the book? How do different characters represent them? And what can we learn from them? Let's start with this kind of evil, vain sort of pride. And I think it's the most obvious one to see throughout the story. First of all, think about how Mr. Darcy, okay, I'm not going to be saying Mr. Darcy, Mrs. Bennet, it's just too much. Let me look up Mr. Darcy's first name. Never mind. From now on, I'll just be referring to him as Darcy. Notice what Darcy says about vanity. He calls vanity a weakness. Pride isn't necessarily a weakness, but specifically vanity is. If you think about someone being vain, typically you think about somebody that's very concerned about their appearance in front of others. Maybe you think of somebody that has a very inflated ego, that thinks they're better than everyone else because of certain factors. Merriam-Webster defines vanity in this way. Quote, vanity is inflated pride in oneself or one's appearance. Notice that word inflated. That's what vanity is. It's a pride that goes beyond what one is due. Someone who is vain is basically trying to be someone they're not. They're trying to act like someone they're not in order to please others, in order to look good in front of others. In essence, vanity is a lie. It's lying to everyone about who you are and how important you are. But maybe more importantly, it's also lying to yourself. And believe me when I say Pride and Prejudice really hammers the point of vanity down. Don't believe me? Well, listen as Jane Austen literally spells out this exact philosophy through the most philosophical character in the entire novel, Mary. In chapter 5, Mary reflects on the vice of pride and says, quote, vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us. Boom! That's it. The theme of Pride and Prejudice in a nutshell. Jane Austen here is defining exactly what vanity or negative pride is. She's saying it's a pride that's really concerned about what others think about you. This type of pride is seen throughout the story in several different characters. Let's first talk about Mrs. Bennet, perhaps the most annoying character in cinematic history. Honestly, she frustrates me almost as much as Umbridge does from Harry Potter. Mrs. Bennet suffers from this type of pride, vanity, because she desperately wants her family to be something it's not. She tries as hard as she possibly can to cover up her family's poverty, to the point where she tries to put other people down. When her family members don't meet her vain standards, she loses her mind. I mean, think about when Elizabeth rejects Mr. Collins' proposal. Like, Mrs. Bennet absolutely loses it. She gets so mad at her own daughter, feels like Elizabeth ruined her life, and threatens never to speak to her again. That's crazy. Or like what we talked about before with her making her daughter Jane ride on a horse rather than in a carriage. That way she could get a cold and get sick, so she can end up with Mr. the handsome guy there. Why can't I remember his name? She is so desperate to look like somebody that she's not. So desperate, in fact, that she actively puts other people in society down to make her family look better. See, she's so concerned about what others in society think about her that she's causing her own self such horrible anxiety. I mean, there's several times throughout the book where Mrs. Bennet is described as being a super anxious person. She calls herself anxious. She tells her daughters that they're going to give her a heart attack if they don't obey her vain commands. Okay, let's take a look at Miss Bingley. That's that guy's name, Mr. Bingley. That's right, Mr. Bingley, and then his sister is Miss Bingley, and then Miss Bingley is interested in Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley is interested in Jane, and Elizabeth is interested in Mr. Darcy, kind of. Okay, I think I got it. Miss Bingley is another character who represents vanity very well, or very poorly, depending on how you look at it. Miss Bingley is desperate for Mr. Darcy's attention. She really likes him a lot. She really wants to marry him. Who wouldn't, right? His name is Mr. Darcy. Come on. He's super rich. What can I say? Anyway, she is a character who actively puts Elizabeth down because she feels threatened by Elizabeth. She wants to appear a certain way in front of Mr. Darcy, and in order to do so, she puts others down. She has no self-confidence because if she had self-confidence, she would just be who she was. She would just act normal and act natural, and she wouldn't have to feel like putting up a front or putting others down in order to gain his approval. But alas, she doesn't, and she ends up being super obnoxious and annoying. I know I'm using these words obnoxious and annoying a lot, but I can't help it. These characters are just obnoxious and annoying. And again, they're meant to be. So, hey, I'm going along with what Jane Austen would want me to think. Sue me. Don't sue me. So maybe Mrs. Bennet, Miss Bingley, pretty obviously have vanity problems. But let's look at somebody else, Mr. Collins. On the surface, I would say it almost looks like Mr. Collins doesn't have a vanity problem. After all, the man is apologizing all of the time. I remember when I was first watching the movie and reading the book, I was like, man, this character's annoying, but I can't pinpoint why. I mean, like, he seems pretty nice. He says all of the right things, but that's exactly it. He puts so much pressure on himself to say the exact right things. Why? Because he wants to look a certain way in front of others. If there's a definition of someone who's not comfortable in their own skin, it's Mr. Collins. So because he doesn't feel comfortable in his own skin, he tries to be someone else. He has the same problem of vanity as someone like Miss Bingley, but he shows it in a different way, through excessively complimenting people. The amount this guy can compliment is absolutely shocking. Like, he should get into the affirmation biz because he would be insanely good at it. I mean, nobody compliments like Mr. Collins. While Miss Bingley shows her vanity by putting others down, Mr. Collins does the exact opposite. He shows his vanity by flattering others. Remember, the idea of vanity is that it's an inflated pride in one's own appearance in front of others. Mr. Collins is excessively worried about what others think about him. That's why he compliments so much. That's why he apologizes so much. Jane Austen's making the point that vanity is never good, not only for the people around these vain characters, but also for the characters themselves. I mean, think about what characterizes Mrs. Bennet, Miss Bingley, and Mr. Collins. They're all super anxious control freaks. Why would anybody want to be that? Why would you want to live in a way where you constantly are anxious about what others think about you? Sometimes we can disguise our vanity and our pride as a weird form of humility. That's just pride. If you're so concerned about what others think about you, that's not a healthy pride at all. It's a focus on yourself and ultimately leads to a lot of anxiety. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the negative side of pride or vanity. But now I want to talk about the positive side of pride. And I want to be careful here. I don't like the term pride because I think typically pride is rightfully viewed as being wrong. I think the more correct term is the word that I've used before. It's confidence and self-respect. And that's exactly what Jane Austen's trying to get through in her book. You know, we already read the quote where Mary said that pride is different from vanity. And so when I talk about positive pride, I'm specifically talking about confidence and self-respect. I think if you look at it the right way, it can really help in understanding what a correct type of self-confidence is versus what a vain, proud type of confidence is. In the beginning of this essay, I already mentioned that Darcy is a character who reflects someone who is confident but is not vain. Earlier in the book, Miss Lucas, or her name's actually Charlotte, she makes a similar case when she says about Darcy, quote, "His pride does not offend me so much as pride often does, because there is an excuse for it. One cannot wonder that so very fine a young man, with family, fortune, and everything in his favor, should think highly of himself. If I may express it, he has a right to be proud." One thing about Darcy is he doesn't vainly shove his position and shove his power down others' throats, but he's also aware of his own position and he's comfortable with it. In a word, he's content. Now, you might be thinking of an instance where he literally tells Elizabeth that he's hesitant about her because of her position and his position, but we're going to get to that in a second. For now, I want to recognize that Darcy, in general, is a very kind and soft-spoken man who is comfortable with his own position. He's not annoying like others because he's not trying to be anybody that he's not. He's just being himself. You can't say the same thing for Mr. Collins or Miss Bingley or Mrs. Bennet. They're trying to be someone else so that they appear a certain way in front of others. Another great example of this positive pride or confidence or contentment is Mr. Bennet, who forms a great foil to Mrs. Bennet. I mean, as much as Mrs. Bennet is the most annoying character in the entire story, Mr. Bennet is honestly the most likable character. He's funny, he's laid back, and again, in a word, he's content. He's not nearly in as good of a position as someone like Darcy, but he's okay with that fact. He's okay with being in the position he's in, and he's not trying to impress anybody. He's not trying to be someone he's not in order to look a certain way in society. Again, the key here is contentment. They're content with who they are. They're content with their position in life. They don't need the approval of society around them to feel content. You get the sense that if Mr. Bennet and Darcy were to swap places, they'd be the exact same person. And that's the definition of contentment, and that's the opposite of vanity. Let's consider the main character now, Elizabeth. I know I haven't talked a lot about her, mainly just because she's one of the more normal characters, so there's not as much to talk about. Elizabeth certainly has flaws, but she's super comfortable with herself. She feels free to speak her mind, and she's okay with being looked down upon in most cases. Again, we'll get to those other cases later. In the case of all three of these characters, and I'm sure there's other characters that I can think of that fit these descriptions, they're comfortable and content with who they are. They're not so self-absorbed because they don't need to be. If you're a vain person, you feel the need to put others down. That way you can look good. We're much more willing to help people when we don't feel threatened by them. And when you're vain, you feel threatened by everyone. When you're confident in who you are, there's no threats from anybody because you get your confidence not from what others think about you, but just from who you are. At this point, you might be thinking that I way overanalyze a simple love story. But that's the thing. I didn't, because I think by talking about the two different types of pride, like vanity versus contentment, it helps us to actually appreciate more the love story that's central to this plot. The love story is more charming because it's genuine. It's real. Remember how I was saying vanity is being someone you're not? It's being disingenuous to who you are because you want to look a certain way in front of others. Whereas contentment and confidence is being okay with oneself and its genuineness. In the story, Elizabeth and Darcy have to fight through the vanity that's in them, just like it's in all of us. They have to fight through that negative pride and vanity to get to a point where they are genuinely in love with each other. Let's look at this because it's pretty cool. When confessing his love for her, Darcy admits that he was initially hesitant because of her position in her life and her family. I can completely understand the family life. If I had Mrs. Bennet as my mother-in-law, I would lose my mind. But the position part, that's less understandable. Unlike popular opinion, Mr. Darcy is not a perfect character. Initially, when he's interacting with Elizabeth and he's interacting with Jane, he seems super proud and super vain because he is. He sees their position and he feels better than them. In the end, Mr. Darcy breaks through his vanity. He breaks through his negative pride to a genuine love for Elizabeth. He lives in a world surrounded by vain people who really care about their appearance in front of others. And he has to fight through that by accepting his own genuine feelings for someone that is in a lesser position than himself. Conflict in Pride and Prejudice is not between any two characters. It's between Pride and Prejudice. Prejudice is a result of vanity, because if Darcy had succumbed to his own vanity, he would have avoided Elizabeth for appearance sake. His own pride in the form of self-respect, however, fights this vanity and allows him to pursue her because he doesn't need the approval of others to be content. To further prove this, listen to what Darcy says in response to Elizabeth after she makes several different accusations against him. Quote, "These offenses might have been overlooked had not your pride been hurt by my honest confession of the scruples that had long prevented my forming any serious design. These bitter accusations might have been suppressed had I, with greater policy, concealed my struggles and flattered you into the belief of my being impelled by unqualified, unallowed inclination, by reason, by reflection, by everything. But disguise of every sort is my abhorrence, nor am I ashamed of the feelings I related." He is making a defense of his own genuineness. Mr. Collins approached Elizabeth with flattery because he's super concerned about appearance. Darcy brought no such flattery because, as he says, he's not ashamed of his own feelings. That's confidence. That's genuine. That's what makes the love story so great. Elizabeth goes through a very similar struggle of vanity versus confidence, and you can see it in her relationship with Darcy and how she views him. She admits early on in the book that she's hurt by Darcy's pride because it hurts her own. In one sense, she let herself fall into the trap of vanity because she was angered by the fact that Darcy didn't see her as she thought she should be seen. Don't believe me? She admits to this herself in chapter 36, quote, "But vanity, not love, has been my folly. pleased with the preference of one and offended by the neglect of the other on the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance and driven reason away where either were concerned. Elizabeth's vanity led her to have a prejudice against Darcy that was only cured when she realized his genuineness. Although much happens afterwards, I believe the moment where Darcy admits his feelings for Elizabeth is the true climax of the story, because it's when these two things, pride and prejudice, really come head to head, and a correct pride or a confidence wins over vanity. Thank you so much for watching this video, guys. Honestly, a big reason why I did this was just kind of to get practice editing. I want to put more stuff on my portfolio, but I really would like to do more video essays. If you want to put anything in the comments, any tips, just any things that you notice, any bad things that you notice, I mean, I want to practice what I preach here and just be okay with myself and be able to accept any criticism that anybody has to give. So yeah, feel free to put any criticisms in the comments. I mean, I appreciate encouragement too. But yeah, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't. Not, that's okay. I'm sorry for wasting your time. But make sure, I guess, smash that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.